A person can be a God-fearing Christian on Sunday and a working scientist come Monday morning without ever having to account for the partition that seems to have erected itself in his head while he slept. This quote highlights the common misconception that science and Christianity always operate in opposition. Sam Harris's so-called partition just historically has not existed. Science and Christianity are not in conflict. They are, in fact, very much connected and have been connected throughout history. This video will focus on the connection between science and Christianity in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. Well, in those 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, most people were educated in what we now call the classical tradition. They learned the teachings of Plato, the teachings of Aristotle, the teachings of Euclid, and then later the teachings of Ptolemy and Galen. Some of these teachings did create suspicion, hostility, and condemnation from the church, but much more often, critical reflection about the nature of the world, which is science, reflection about the nature of the world, science was tolerated and in most cases encouraged by the early Christian religious leaders. Well, these early Christian leaders used the tools they learned through the classical method to help develop Christian doctrine and to help defend the faith against its detractors of the time. All of these church fathers expressed at least limited approval of the classical tradition. They knew, they used, and they generally agreed with the science of the day. Interesting fact also, Paul, Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Clement, and Tertullian, they were educated in the classical tradition first before they converted to Christianity. So most of the church fathers or the Christian leaders in this list knew the science of the day and then converted to Christianity afterwards. Here's an example of how the classical tradition can be used to support Christianity. Aristotle's unmoved mover can be used to rationally argue for the existence of God. So some other examples of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century Christian leaders and how they co-opted the classical tradition, what they learned in the classical tradition, with their Christian faith. So Paul, this is Paul of the Bible, much of his speech to the Epicureans and the Stoics at the Areopagus in Athens, and you can find that in Acts, seems to allude to Stoic beliefs. Well, this reflected sympathy with the pagan customs, and Paul appealed for a new examination of divinity to take a new look at their gods from practical engagement with the world, which means Paul was asking the Epicureans and the Stoics in Athens to do science and see what that showed them about who the true God is. In Romans, he again champions natural theology and wants people to reflect on the natural world. Justin Martyr held Greek philosophy in extremely high esteem. He thought that the Greek philosophers were inspired by the incarnate Christ. Irenaeus defended the Christian faith against the Gnostics. The Gnostic religion or the Gnostic sect, if that was allowed to continue, it would have been a science stopper. The Gnostics believed that matter was evil and that the world was evil, and if matter and the world were evil, then you probably wouldn't have studied it. They probably wouldn't have done science. So by teaching that matter was both real and good, Irenaeus allowed science to continue within the Christian worldview. Another interesting fact about Irenaeus is a 2nd generation apostle. Irenaeus was taught by Polycarp, who was taught by John, and that's the John of the Bible. Athenagoras used the teachings of Plato, of Aristotle, and of the Stoics. And the Stoics, in those days, the Stoics were the logic teachers and the physics teachers. So he used the science of the day to argue for monotheism. Clement of Alexandria thought that the Greek philosophy was a schoolmaster to bring the Greeks to Christ. He used Greek philosophy to bring clarity to the early creeds of Christianity and taught that the classical philosophers had at least part of the truth. An interesting fact about Clement is a 3rd generation apostle. He was taught by Pantaenus, who was taught by Justus, who was taught by Peter and Mark, and again, that's Peter and Mark of the Bible. Tertullian had some of the harshest criticisms of the classic teachings, but still in the end thought that Christianity was the ultimate fulfillment of the Greek rationality. And then Origen found Greek philosophy a very useful tool in the defense of Christianity. So, in summary, the early church fathers, the early 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century Christian leaders deeply valued Aristotle and the teachings of the classical tradition. They used logic, they used reason, they used the science of the day to support and argue for Christianity. Harris's partition just did not exist in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. And in fact, science and Christianity were not in opposition, and the early Christian leaders worked very well with the science of the day and melded it into their Christian faith. If you want to read more about this, here's all my social media information.